Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. We've got you covered. Traditional leagues, Dynasty League, PPR League, IDP League, even Daily Fantasy Football League. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Kenneth Gruenfelder, and we have a lot to cover today. In our first segment, I'm going to be talking about the top 10 fantasy players going into the 2021 season. These are the top 10 players that I believe will be the first players taken off the draft board in any of your fantasy drafts, whether it's standard or PPR. These are the 10 players that I believe going into the 2021 season that it is essential that you get these players in the first round wherever you are drafting. In the second segment, we're going to be covering the top 5 sleepers going into the 2021 season. These are players that went under the radar, were on the waiver wire, and a lot of other fantasy players picked them up to make their teams better. Late season acquisitions. But now these guys are going to be moving up in the rankings in this upcoming fantasy football season. And these are the players that I believe you're going to want to get these guys at the right times wherever you're drafting, what rounds, more, mid-tier, mid-round picks. But they're definitely guys that you're going to want to keep an eye on as you progress through your draft. Then for the third segment of today's show, we're going to talk about the top 5 players you're going to want to avoid in this upcoming fantasy season. Players have not maybe have kind of fallen back in terms of usage, are significantly declining, or just have a problem with the injury bug and can't stay healthy. These are the guys that I believe you might want to stay away from heading into the draft. And maybe, if you're looking for a spot, if they're one of your last draft picks, you can't really go wrong with that. But these are guys that, for the most part, you want to stay away from heading into your fantasy drafts for this upcoming NFL season. And then finally, for segment 4, we're going to cover basically my career as a fantasy football player. I've been doing fantasy football since 2013. I've won a lot of leagues. I haven't finished in a high place in the standings in some of my fantasy football leagues. I've had some heartbreaking losses, especially this past season. There's been a lot of blunders, a lot of great things that I've done. There's a lot of things that I've done that I'm very proud that I've done. There's a lot of things that I've done that I'm not so happy about. Formed some grudges against some players because of some things that have happened. So segment number 4 is going to cover basically what my career as a fantasy player has been like over the past 8 years. So to kind of recap the segments, top 10 fantasy players. Segment 2 is going to be top 5 sleepers. Segment 3 is going to be top 5 players you want to avoid. And segment number 4, which will be the last segment of the day, my career as a fantasy football player. So let's start off with segment number 1, is the top 10 fantasy players that I believe you should be drafting in the first round going into the 2021 season. So to start off the list at number 10, we got DeAndre Hopkins, who is the wide receiver for the Arizona Cardinals. This was DeAndre Hopkins' first season with the Arizona Cardinals after he came over in that embarrassing trade with the Houston Texans. Obviously, many people heavily criticized Texans' former head coach, Bill O'Brien, for that trade. DeAndre Hopkins is obviously one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, and Bill O'Brien basically just gave him up for a running back in David Johnson, who really kind of lost his role on the team over the past couple of seasons. Suffered some injuries, and then the Cardinals acquired Kenyon Drake, and David Johnson kind of lost playing time. So that trade probably is going to go down as one of the worst trades in recent memory, and kind of one of the reasons why Bill O'Brien doesn't have a job right now in the NFL. So why I have DeAndre Hopkins at number 10 is he did kind of take a step back in productivity. Obviously, he was known for the play that many people call the Hail Murray against the Buffalo Bills, which I remember being at my cousin's house for that game, and we were all going crazy over that play. Definitely the best play of the year. He had 1,400 yards this past season. Definitely lost some productivity when it came to touchdowns. Only had 6 receiving touchdowns on the season. Really not the fantasy numbers that you're prone to getting out of DeAndre Hopkins. But he did have some good games, obviously, against the Buffalo Bills, like I just previously mentioned, with the Hail Murray. He had 25 points in that game. Against Seattle, in that crazy game, he had 24 points. Week 1, he had a great showing. Caught ultimately the game-winning touchdown against the San Francisco 49ers. But he did have a couple of clunkers. There was the game against Miami. He really only had 6 points. 9 points against Dallas. Really didn't do that much in that route. Had 11 points against Carolina. Had 7 points against the Rams in Week 17. Now, you could argue that was because Kyler Murray was in and out of the lineup. And I think it's also because he was adjusting to the new system that he was in. And, I think he's going to have a bounce-back season. I think he's still the second best wide receiver going into your fantasy draft. I think he's more of a late first-round pick because I think there are receivers that are better than him, and there are running backs that you definitely want to get. I think running back is the best, most valued position when it comes to drafting. So at number 9, speaking of running backs, we got Saints running back Alvin Kamara. Now, the one thing that many people are going to wonder is why is Alvin Kamara lower on this list? And I think one of the main reasons why I have him lower is because of we don't really know who the quarterback is going to be for the Saints. Drew Brees recently announced his retirement earlier this month, and there's a lot of question marks as to who is going to be the starting quarterback. They paid Taysom Hill. They re-signed Jameis Winston. I think that's one of the things you have to worry about is the quarterback position going to be a key factor in Alvin Kamara's productivity. Now, especially in PPR, he's definitely going to be valued. He's definitely going to be a high-volume guy that is going to get the ball. He did have a monster game, having over 50 points in the Christmas game against the Vikings with 6 touchdowns, 377 points in PPR this past season, and 294 in standard leagues. Like I said, he's a high-volume guy. He's a guy you want to have on your team. He was banged up a couple times in 2019. Had that crazy run against Green Bay in Week 3. This guy is an explosive playmaker. Definitely one of the guys you want to draft if you're, kind of in no man's land. Because, kind of the last 2 picks in the first round, most of the guys that you typically are going to want are going to be taken off the board. But it's probably the safe bet to go with Alvin Kamara. Like I said, the concerns are who's going to be the quarterback. That's something that people have to look into. But I think with the Saints, they're kind of going through a reshifting, a retooling phase. Obviously, they were $100 million over the cap, and they had to cut a lot of guys, like Emmanuel Sanders, like Jared Cook. One thing you got to think about is what's the status with Michael Thomas? Could the Saints be moving on from him as well? So I think with the combination of all that, I think Alvin Kamara is going to be a very valuable asset to your team if you draft him in the first round. like I said, and have been saying, the one concern you may have is who the quarterback is going to be. But even with that, he's going to be a very high volume guy going into this 2021 NFL season. At number 8, I have Saquon Barkley, the running back for the New York Giants. Now, Saquon only played in one full game. He was injured in week 2 against the Bears, tore his ACL, was out for the rest of the season. And the Giants had to use guys like Wayne Gallman, Alfred Morris, Dion Lewis, and Devontae Freeman. So people are looking to Saquon Barkley and saying to themselves, is this going to be the year that he finally breaks out after coming off of this major injury? Now, I'm hoping so, just because Saquon is a great guy, and I think that the Giants put a lot of stock into him by drafting him number 2 overall back in 2018 when they should have taken a quarterback in most people's eyes, considering that Eli Manning was declining and the Giants needed to move off of him. But Saquon has been productive when he has played. I think a lot of the things hindered him from being more consistent is the offensive line. The Giants' offensive line has been putrid over the last several years, and it seems like they're finally starting to rebuild it the right way, and it seems like they're bringing in guys that are going to be productive for them. Their offensive line is relatively young, and they definitely improved as the season progressed. And I think because of that, I think Saquon Barkley is going to have a good season. Now, the reason why I have him lower on this list is because I just think that he's coming off a major injury. I think that he still needs to prove himself, and I think there's better guys out there in this fantasy draft that you could take over him if you have an earlier pick. Now, if you're one of those later picks in the later part of the first round, I think he's still definitely a first-round pick. In his rookie season, he was a top 5 pick. And he definitely produced, but like I said, he's got to be more consistent, and he has to hope that his offensive line can hold up for him and have a good season. Kind of looking at his numbers, he had 1,300 yards in 2018. He had barely over 1,000 yards in 2019, only playing in 13 games, and obviously played in 2 due to the fact that he tore his ACL against the Bears. I'm anticipating that Saquon Barkley is going to have a good season. So I think with that and the fact that he has the tendency to have some very explosive runs, obviously he had a lot of those against Washington in 2019. I just think that he still has to be respected as a first-round pick. That's why I have Saquon Barkley at number 8. At number 7, this is kind of a risky pick, but I have Ezekiel Elliott, running back for the Dallas Cowboys. And the main reason for that is I think with Dak Prescott coming back from his terrible, horrific ankle injury, I think that that's going to open up the door for Ezekiel Elliott to get back to how he was as a running back and being more of a force coming out of the backfield for the Dallas Cowboys. Obviously, his rookie season was his best year by far, having 1,600 yards. His rookie season, 15 rushing touchdowns, averaging about 19 fantasy points per game. With Dak Prescott coming back, like I said, I think that's going to open the door for Zeke. I think he's poised to have a really good season, and I think the Cowboys are going to address the offensive line in the draft because the offensive line isn't what it was in years past. And I think because of that, if they can rebuild and retool that offensive line and guys come back healthy, because Tyron Smith, their left tackle, was injured last season. Zach Martin was in and out of the lineup. We don't know what the status is of La'el Collins, a guy that they drafted in 2015. But I think if they can retool the offensive line and Dak Prescott comes back, I think that's going to open up the door for more opportunities for Ezekiel Elliott to get back to how he was, because he tied his season low of rushing touchdowns with only 6 and didn't even reach 1,000 yards. In 2017, he only played in 10 games, and he still had 983 yards rushing. This season, he played in 15 games, and he only had 979 yards. That is not acceptable for the money that he's being paid and the city that he plays in. Because you definitely saw, without Dak Prescott, Ezekiel Elliott's numbers did suffer. Against the Cardinals, he only had 4 points, and he had 2 fumbles in that game. That's the other cause for concern with Ezekiel Elliott, is he's been fumbling way too much, especially this past season without Dak Prescott. But I think with Dak Prescott and a retooled offensive line and the weapons that they have at their disposal, I think that that's going to open up play action, and it's going to give Zeke more opportunities to have better games, because he definitely suffered without having consistent QB play, and Dallas really just being a terrible team this past season. At number 6, I have Travis Kelce, tight end for the Kansas City Chiefs. This guy is unbelievable. He definitely has cemented himself as the best tight end in the NFL. I don't think it's really close, especially with George Kittle not playing in many games this past season. Travis Kelce, again, putting up 1,400 yards receiving, 11 touchdowns, was a key contributor to the Chiefs getting to the Super Bowl once again, and definitely is Patrick Mahomes' security blanket. In 15 games this season, had 105 receptions. In standard leagues, he had 207 points, which is the most of his career. Definitely has been a lot more productive now with Patrick Mahomes as his quarterback, when the Chiefs made the transition from Alex Smith to Patrick Mahomes back in 2018. And you kind of just go down the list of the games that Travis Kelce played and really was pretty consistent. His worst game, I believe, came against the Denver Broncos, the first time the Chiefs and the Broncos played this past season. Only getting 3 points, but again, that was kind of a very interesting game when it came to the weather. The Chiefs definitely didn't really need to do much because the Broncos were pretty bad this past season, and the weather definitely played a factor for both sides. Definitely running the football was more of a priority in that game. But I just think Travis Kelce is probably the second best receiver in the fantasy drafts. I think that even though he's a tight end, again, he's another high-volume guy, and Patrick Mahomes always looks to find him because defenses are trying to focus in on Tyreek Hill and double up on him because Tyreek Hill can get you over the top if you're not careful. You definitely saw that the first time the Buccaneers and the Chiefs played in 2020. Travis Kelce is very reliable. One of the things that was concerning was the amount of drops that he had in the Super Bowl, but I don't think that's a major concern. But the guy is a force when he's healthy, and that's another great thing about Travis Kelce is he's durable. He really hasn't had any major injuries so far in his career, and he's looking to build off of what he's done in 2020, and maybe he's going to be even better in 2021. But I think in leagues, especially PPR, you're going to want to get Travis Kelce because of the amount of usage that he gets per game. And as long as Patrick Mahomes is throwing him the football, Travis Kelce is going to be a top fantasy player in 2021 and repeat what he did in 2020. At number 5, I have Nick Chubb, running back for the Cleveland Browns. In only 12 games this season, Nick Chubb had over 1,000 yards, 12 rushing touchdowns, and had 191 points total in fantasy this past season. He had 219 in 2019. Only playing in 12 games due to the injury that he suffered back in week 4, I want to say, against the Dallas Cowboys. And definitely when he came back, the Cleveland Browns were very happy to have him. Obviously, they have Kareem Hunt, who took over the reins as the lead back in this past season. It was definitely something concerning going into the season, whether or not Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt were going to be able to work as a duo. Would we see one player getting more carries? Would we see one player taking away carries? And we definitely did see that. But the Browns, I think, have the best one-two punch in the NFL when it comes to their running backs. I think both of these guys can be number one backs on any team. Kareem Hunt proved that back when he was a running back for the Kansas City Chiefs. The Browns have the best one-two punch in the NFL when it comes to running backs. And I think Nick Chubb definitely is another high-volume guy. I think that he's didn't get as many red zone looks as I thought he was going to get, because I had him in one of my leagues, and I'll go into it more once we get into the last segment of the show. But I think Nick Chubb is going to be poised to have another breakout season. I think the Browns' offensive line vastly improved this past season. The Browns definitely went through a culture change when it came to hiring head coach Kevin Stefanski, and Baker Mayfield improved as well. And I think that the combination of all those things, I really think that Nick Chubb is once again going to be a first-round pick. I think the other thing with him is he's very consistent. When he came back from the injury, and even before the injury, Nick Chubb was very consistent. There was really never any games that he didn't provide some help for your fantasy team. He was definitely a top 10 running back, definitely top 5 running back, and I think he definitely elevated his stature as a first-round running back heading into next season. At number 5, I got Packers wide receiver Davante Adams, and I think he is the best receiver in the NFL, and I think he's the best receiver going into any of your fantasy drafts. I think he's the obvious pick to be the number one wide receiver taken off the board in fantasy drafts. Going through his statistics, in 14 games this past season, Davante Adams had 1,374 receiving yards. He had 18 touchdowns, which led the NFL, and he had his career high in fantasy points, 243, and this is the standard for standard leagues. He's Aaron Rodgers' top target. Again, another high-volume guy, a guy that's going to get you, your 20 points per game. He's the best receiver in the NFL. I think there's no question about it. He caught Aaron Rodgers' 400th career touchdown pass, and he's really improved every season. Now, the one thing you got to worry about with him is injuries. He did miss 2 games this season. Last season, he missed, I think it was 4 games with the turf toe. I think that's the one thing you got to be concerned is he durable? Is he going to play a full season? Either way, the guy is a must-have on your team. If you are picking in the middle of the first round and he's still there, you got to take him. Davante Adams, number 5 on this list. At number 4 on the list, I have Tennessee Titans running back Derrick Henry, coming off of a 2,000-yard rushing season, becoming the 8th running back in NFL history to accomplish this feat. The last time a running back did that was Adrian Peterson back in 2012 when he won his first and only NFL MVP. The last time a non-quarterback won an MVP. Now, the reason why I have Derrick Henry at number 4 is because the guy really has improved every season since entering the league back in 2016. Really kind of cemented himself as a top running back towards the end of the 2018 season, and obviously the huge playoff run that the Tennessee Titans had back in 2019, obviously upsetting the Baltimore Ravens in the divisional round, and unfortunately ending their season short when they lost to the Kansas City Chiefs in the AFC title game a couple years back. He had 17 rushing touchdowns this season, And the one thing that concerns me with Derrick Henry is the Baltimore Ravens held him to 40 yards on 18 carries in the wild card round this past season, and I'm wondering if teams are going to take advantage of that and use that to their advantage anytime they go up against the Tennessee Titans, because Ryan Tannehill did not play well in that playoff game as well, and I think teams are going to use that to their advantage. I think that many teams are now going to load up the box and try to shut down Derrick Henry and try to minimize his impact on the game and get Ryan Tannehill to try and win the game himself. Looking at the statistics for Derrick Henry, he's improved in rushing yards every season and has improved his touchdowns in every season. There's been a gradual increase. He really is a force. This past season, he had his career high in fantasy points with 314 when it comes to standard fantasy football leagues, and he's definitely going to be a top running back again. But like I said, the thing you have to be concerned about is how he was shut down in the playoff game against the Ravens. Like I said, I believe that teams are going to look at that tape and see if they can try to replicate what the Ravens did in that playoff game and try to make this team one-dimensional, because there are some question marks with the weapons on that offense for the Tennessee Titans. But I still think that Derrick Henry is a top running back in this league, and he's going to be a top player when it comes to drafting your fantasy team in this upcoming draft. At number 2, I have Minnesota Vikings running back Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook, again, another player that reached his career high in fantasy points with 293 in standard leagues. He had another great season, 1,500 rushing yards, 16 rushing touchdowns in 14 games this season. Had some major breakout games, especially the game against Green Bay when he had 4 total touchdowns and had over 46 points. Was another outstanding performance there. Had another good performance against the Lions. This is another guy that is a high-volume guy. The Vikings are a much better team when he is healthy. Kirk Cousins benefits from having this guy in the backfield. You could even see in the games that, you can even judge it by the games where Dalvin Cook does not play. Kirk Cousins is a much different quarterback. When Dalvin Cook is healthy, this team is really good, and he's very consistent. Obviously, his rookie year, he tore his ACL. He only played in a couple of games, and then in 2018, he was still kind of working his way back. But then in 2019, he broke out, and in 2020, he continued his success in the running game for the Minnesota Vikings. I think he's the second best running back in football. I think he's one of the more consistent running backs. He's definitely, again, something that I continue to say throughout this list, is a high-volume guy. He's going to get a ton of carries. And like I say for a lot of these guys on this list, as long as he stays healthy, he's going to give you a lot of good numbers, a lot of good stats. And anticipate that Dalvin Cook is going to have another great season, and he's definitely going to be one of the top running backs taken off the board in fantasy drafts. And finally, at number 1, I have Carolina Panthers running back Christian McCaffrey. Now, Christian McCaffrey only played in 3 games this season, injuring his ankle, suffering a high ankle sprain back in Week 2 versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And like I said, was only relegated to just 3 games this past season. But he still had 5 touchdowns. He had over 30 points He had 20-plus points in every game he played in. He had 2 touchdowns in Week 1 against the Vegas Raiders. He had 2 touchdowns against Tampa Bay, and he did have one. He had 2 total touchdowns against the Kansas City Chiefs, 1 rushing, 1 receiving. This is still, in my opinion, the best pick when it comes to fantasy drafts. Like Alvin Kamara, he's definitely going to benefit from being a receiving back. He's not a power back like Nick Chubb or Ezekiel Elliott, but the guy is a very high-volume guy. He's going to get a lot of targets. He's going to be the focal point, really, of that offense, and I anticipate that he's going to have a really good bounce-back season after, again, only just playing 3 games. again, another question mark with him is kind of the same thing like I talked about with Alvin Kamara, is the question mark at quarterback. Who's going to be the quarterback for the Carolina Panthers? Is it going to be Teddy Bridgewater, or is it going to be somebody that the Panthers are looking at in the draft? Who knows, but either way, I think this is too good of a pick to pass up on if you have the number one pick. I think Christian McCaffrey is the guy that you have to go to, whether it's a standard league or PPR. Christian McCaffrey is the number one fantasy player going into 2021, in my opinion. So kind of to do a quick recap of what the list is, we got DeAndre Hopkins at 10, Alvin Kamara at 9, Saquon Barkley at 8, Ezekiel Elliott at 7, Travis Kelce at 6, Nick Chubb at 5, Devontae Adams at 4, Derrick Henry at 3, Dalvin Cook at 2, and Christian McCaffrey rounds out the list at number 1. So with that, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the top 5 sleepers going into the 2021 season. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kenneth Gruenfelder. We talked about in segment 1 the top 10 fantasy football players heading into the 2021 season. So now we're moving on to segment number 2, which is the top 5 sleepers that I believe are poised to have some breakout seasons here in 2021. So let's get right into it. So at number 5, I have Baker Mayfield, the quarterback of the Cleveland Browns. Now the reason why I have Baker Mayfield here is I just believe that with Kevin Stefanski coming in and becoming the new head coach for the Cleveland Browns this past season, I just think Baker Mayfield made big strides. And at times he looked like the number 1 overall pick that the Browns used back in 2018 to get him. He looked like the quarterback that the Browns wanted him to be. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that the Browns kind of took the ball out of Baker Mayfield's hands at times and kind of relied on their running game between Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. And I think that Baker Mayfield excelled in this new scheme that Kevin Stefanski implemented for the Cleveland Browns. He definitely had a lot of good games this season. He played well in the playoff games. If it wasn't for a questionable call in the divisional round versus the Kansas City Chiefs, where Sorensen hit Cordero Hodge in the head at the goal line, and the referees missed that call, and it ended up just being a touchback out of the back of the end zone. You know, the Browns could have easily won that game, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that Patrick Mahomes was injured during the game, and that kind of sparked the comeback for the Browns, and the comeback did fall short. But Baker definitely elevated himself as a quarterback, and I think also he matured a little bit, and I think that was also a key factor. looking at his numbers from this past season, you could see that Baker Mayfield definitely improved each of the last 3 seasons. In 14 games in 2018, he had 27 touchdowns, 14 interceptions. In 2019, he kind of took a step back, but in 2020, he was good. 26 touchdowns to 8 interceptions. He had 247 fantasy points, which matches or eclipses his career high in fantasy points. And I just think when you look at some of the games that he's had, the most notable one had to be against the Baltimore Ravens when he had 30 points. That was his best game of the season by far. And I just think that he's kind of one of those quarterbacks that you could get in the later rounds, a guy that you could probably get in the 12th, 13th round. I think he's going to definitely be one of those guys that you got to look out for, especially because of the requisite weapons that he has at his disposal. Jarvis Landry, they brought back Austin Hooper. Who knows what the status is with Odell Beckham Jr. The Browns are going to continue to build that offensive line, and I think Baker Mayfield is only going to get better as time goes on. And I think that, especially in a 2 QB league, which I typically do with my friends, he's definitely a guy that you want to look at as a QB2 and possibly a QB1. I think this season could potentially be Baker Mayfield's best, because typically with quarterbacks in year 2 of their second year under new systems, they tend to excel in year 2. You look at guys like Matt Ryan under Kyle Shanahan's new scheme back in 2015, and in 2016, the Falcons were able to make it to the Super Bowl, and Matt Ryan won MVP. Even guys like Eli Manning under Ben McAdoo's scheme, increasing his touchdown totals from 30 to 35 between the 2014 and 2015 season. Even look at guys like Aaron Rodgers and Matt LaFleur's new system. Aaron Rodgers had a pretty productive season in 2019, and in 2020 he won MVP. So I think Baker Mayfield is only going to get better, and I think that, again, if you're looking for a QB that, could provide some stability at the position, if you're looking at other positions to kind of build your team, Baker Mayfield could definitely be one of those late round QBs that you could snag and definitely could benefit you in the long run. So at number 4, I got the newly acquired Washington football team wide receiver Curtis Samuel. Curtis Samuel just finished his 4th season in the NFL and kind of was the forgotten man when you look at guys like Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore. Curtis Samuel was kind of the odd man out between those 3 guys, and I think this was a great signing for the Washington football team. You put him opposite of Terry McLaurin. I think that this is going to be a great season for Curtis Samuel, and you kind of look at his numbers from the 2020 season. Definitely a versatile wide receiver. This past season, he put up 851 yards receiving, 3 touchdowns, but also they made him more of a versatile type player, because there were some question marks at the running back position for the Carolina Panthers when Christian McCaffrey was out due to injury, and the Panthers kind of put him as a running back in some formations, and he had 200 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns. He had 1 fumble this season. He had the most fantasy points in his career this past season with 135 when it comes to standard. But I kind of just think that, now being in Washington, where Terry McLaurin is kind of the main target, and you got other guys like Logan Thomas at tight end, I think Curtis Samuel is definitely going to excel in this role, and I think he's definitely would be a very good, solid wide receiver 2 or a flex position. Now that he's not the 3rd option, because if he was still in Carolina and Christian McCaffrey comes back, that's only going to decrease his targets. Now that you're in Washington, where they really only have one wide receiver that you could really depend on, I think that's only going to benefit him. And I think because of that, he is going to have a much bigger role in Washington than he did in Carolina. So I would say that Curtis Samuel will be the number 4 sleeper pick going into the 2021 NFL season. All right, and at number 3, this is probably one of my more unique picks, one of my more favorite picks, and that's wide receiver for the 49ers, Brandon Ayuk. He was drafted, just finished his rookie season. He went to Arizona State. The guy's only 23, and when he was on the field, he was very dynamic. He's kind of a Deebo Samuel type player. They ran a lot of end-arounds with him, and the 49ers definitely this kid a lot. He was definitely explosive every time he was on the field. Definitely, he was also another one of those guys that was in and out of the lineup due to injury, which a lot of the guys on the 49ers were during the course of the 2020 season. But when you look at Brandon Ayuk, he definitely is going to have an increased role going into this season. The one thing that I have to worry about is the quarterback position for the 49ers. You don't know what the status is going to be with Jimmy Garoppolo. And you don't know what the 49ers are going to do because now they just traded up in the draft and now they have the number 3 overall pick. So it looks like there's going to be some kind of QB controversy going into this season. And it's going to be interesting to see who is going to start for the 49ers come September. But I just think Brandon Ayuk is a very dynamic player. He's definitely somebody that you could 100% get in the late rounds. He could definitely be a solid flex option. And I think that's very important in fantasy is to have a solid flex option, and you could obviously put him, you can plug and play him, at wide receiver 2, and, if any of your star players has a bye week, you'd always plug and play him in, wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2. And again, could be a solid flex option every week. I think that especially with him, being very versatile and using him like Deebo Samuel with the end arounds, that's going to create more opportunities for him to get fantasy points for your team. And, I'm expecting Deebo Samuel and George Kittle to come back healthy. So that offense for the 49ers has the potential to be very dynamic next season. Now, yes, you have to worry about him not getting a lot of targets or as many targets as guys like George Kittle or Deebo Samuel, like I just said. And the 49ers do like to run the ball. But I think Kyle Shanahan has a lot of tools to work with going into this season, and he's going to have a lot of versatility on that offense. And I think Brandon Ayuk, if he stays healthy, and that's kind of a reoccurring theme throughout this show, is guys got to stay healthy. And I think Brandon Ayuk is definitely going to continue to develop, and be another dynamic playmaker, and continue to be another dynamic playmaker on this offense going into this 2021 season. And like I said, definitely can snag him in the late rounds and potentially be a solid flex option and a possible number 2 wide receiver for your fantasy team. And moving on from this list, we got at number 2, we got running back for the Los Angeles Rams, Cam Akers. The guy is 21 years old and will be going into his second season in the NFL. The Rams drafted him in round 2 of the NFL draft in 2020 from Florida State. I think he's poised to have a breakout season, and you saw towards the end of the season, the Rams were using him a lot more. Really had his breakout game against the New England Patriots in Week 14 when he had 29 rushing attempts for 171 yards, averaging 5.9 yards per carry. In standard leagues, he only had 90 points, but I think there's going to be a drastic increase when it comes to Cam Akers. Early on in the season, the Rams were trying to figure out their new identity. They had all these flashy plays, and, guys like Brandon Cooks were traded in the offseason. The Rams were not the offensive team that we were accustomed to seeing between Sean McVay's first 2 seasons as the head coach of the Rams. And they kind of took a step back offensively, and obviously Todd Gurley left in free agency and signed with the Atlanta Falcons in the offseason. So they had Malcolm Brown, they had Darrell Henderson, and they had Cam Akers, who they drafted. Now, it was kind of a running back committee for a large part of the season, and at one point it seemed like Darrell Henderson kind of was going to take that lead back role. I know after week 1, for me as a player, I was trying to pick up Malcolm Brown after week 1 when he had a very nice game against the Cowboys week 1. So Cam Akers, kind of was the forgotten man until late in the season when he started getting more carries and he was effective. Definitely was used a lot more in the final 4 games that he played in. He missed week 16, but in the final 4 games, he had 21 carries against the Cardinals. He had 29 carries against New England. Only had 15 against the Jets, and then he had 21 in week 17 against the Arizona Cardinals. I'm anticipating that Cam Akers is going to be the lead back. He might have to win it over in camp again. Who knows? I think that he is poised to take the next step. And I think another component that I haven't talked about is the fact that the Rams acquired Matthew Stafford in the offseason from the Detroit Lions. They did a QB swap, sending Jared Goff over to Detroit. I think that's also going to help Cam Akers as well. I think that defenses are going to be more alert now with Matthew Stafford. I think Matthew Stafford is a big upgrade over Jared Goff, and I think that play action is going to play a huge role in this offense because I think that's something that Sean McVay typically likes to do in his scheme, and I think that's going to open up opportunities for Cam Akers, and I think that the Rams still have a pretty good offensive line, and I think that Cam Akers is going to benefit from that, and I think he's going to be used a lot, and I think he's a guy that you could definitely take in the late rounds, especially if you're looking for an RB2. I think he would be a great RB2, and I think he proved that in the regular season, and I think he proved that in the postseason as well against Seattle. I think Cam Akers is somebody that a lot of people are going to be looking at to draft and be a sleeper in the late rounds as well, and I think because of that, I have him at number 2. So at number 1, I got the Colts running back, Jonathan Taylor. I think that he can possibly be an RB1. Going into this season, there was a lot of question marks at the running back position for the Indianapolis Colts. They had Marlon Mack, who was on a contract year. They had Nyheim Hines, and they took Jonathan Taylor in the 2020 draft. He was a second-round pick as well. Only 22 years of age, and he'll be going into his second season, but he's going to be the Colts' lead running back. I think that there are a little less question marks surrounding the running back position for the Indianapolis Colts, as opposed to the Los Angeles Rams, which they have kind of a loaded backfield, more of a loaded backfield as opposed to Jonathan Taylor. I think Jonathan Taylor definitely separated himself from the other running backs on the Colts. And obviously, he got the opportunity because Marlon Mack tore his Achilles, I believe in week 1 of the NFL season when the Colts took on the Jacksonville Jaguars and actually lost that game. I think Jonathan Taylor is going to have a great season and continue his success, his second half success from 2020. I think by far his best game was week 17 against the Jaguars when he had 30 rushing attempts for 253 rushing yards, 8.4 rushing yards, 8.4 yards on average, averaging 8.4 yards. During that game, he had 2 touchdowns in that game. He led the NFL in rushing among rookie running backs. Definitely had a pretty productive second half to the season, averaging over 10 points per game. Very consistent. Another good game that he had was against the Vegas Raiders when he had 20 attempts for 150 yards and 2 touchdowns. I think the other thing that's going to benefit Jonathan Taylor is the fact that the Colts did make a QB change in the offseason. They acquired Carson Wentz from the Philadelphia Eagles, and I think Carson Wentz is definitely an upgrade over Phillip Rivers. He's a more mobile QB. Now, Carson Wentz definitely left Philly with a bad taste in his mouth, and he's definitely looking to kind of reinvent himself and go back to playing the way he is capable of playing, like in 2017 when Frank Reich was the offensive coordinator for the Philadelphia Eagles. I think Jonathan Taylor is going to benefit from that. And also the fact that the Colts are have one of the best offensive lines in football. I think that's only going to benefit Jonathan Taylor even more. And I just think that now him being the lead back from the start of the season, because he's 100% going to be the lead back going into this season. I think there's no question about that. He had a pretty good playoff performance in the wild card round against the Buffalo Bills. I think that he's poised to have a breakout season as well. I think he's only going to get better in year 2, and especially now because Marlon Mack is no longer there, and Nyheim Hines is really typically only used for passing down situations. And I think that Jonathan Taylor is going to be that lead back. He's going to be that 3-down bell cow running back. And he's only going to get better. I think that now playing the full season as the lead running back, he's going to put up monster numbers, I anticipate. And he's somebody that you're definitely going to want to get, between the 3rd and 5th round. I think he's kind of one of those that you got to be a little bit more aggressive with as opposed to Cam Akers. I think Cam Akers is kind of somebody that you would take later in the draft. Jonathan Taylor is somebody you're definitely going to want to take between the 3rd and 5th round. So that rounds out the list for the top 5 sleepers going into the 2021 NFL season fantasy drafts. So kind of to recap the list, we have Baker Mayfield at number 5, Curtis Samuel at number 4, Brandon Ayuk at number 3, Cam Akers at number 2, and Jonathan Taylor at number 1 to round out that list. So with that, we are going to take another quick break. When we come back, we are going to talk about the top 5 players that you want to avoid drafting in the 2021 NFL season. So with that, we're going to take another quick break. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA, from the UFC to extreme cage fighting. They got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, and we are back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. In the last segment, we talked about the top 5 sleepers going into your 2021 fantasy football drafts. Now we're going to be talking about the top 5 players that you might want to avoid going into the 2021 fantasy football season. So with that, I'm going to kick off the list with a quarterback. At number 5, I got quarterback Big Ben Roethlisberger, who just finished his 17th season in the NFL. He is now 39 years of age. And now look, Ben Roethlisberger has been a productive player pretty much his entire career. He's definitely going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. And I think that him coming back this past season definitely benefited the Steelers in a multitude of ways, especially because they had to deal with the past, especially when they had to deal with Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges being the starting quarterbacks in 2019. Ben Roethlisberger definitely elevated this offense. This offense was pretty good last season, but definitely towards the end of the season, Big Ben kind of tailed off a little bit, and you kind of saw that he was declining as a QB, and it looks like he's kind of on his way out. But the Steelers did bring him back, and he's definitely going to be the number one QB for the Steelers going into the 2021 season. When you really look at his stats, though, he did have a productive season. He did play in 15 games. Obviously, he rested in Week 17 when the Steelers took on the Browns. In the regular season finale, he had 33 touchdowns to only 10 interceptions and passed for 3,800 yards. So that, when you look at that, that's a good season statistically. But when you look at how he played in games like the Bengals on Monday Night Football, he was 20 of 38 for only 170 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, had a QB rating of only 62. That's not very good. And you look at the game the week before that, 21 of 37, 187 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, only a 65 QB rating against the Buffalo Bills. That's not very good either. I think a lot of the Steelers' woes did come from the fact that their schedule was pretty crazy. The fact that they had to move their bye week unannounced. The fact that they had to move their bye week because of the fact that the Titans were experiencing a COVID outbreak, I think that definitely had a lot to do with it. The fact that the Ravens game, the Thanksgiving game that they were supposed to have against the Ravens, that kept getting pushed back and that got moved to a Wednesday night. But as I was saying, though, with that, I think a lot of the fact that the Steelers had to move around their schedules and games were being changed and they didn't know what day they were playing, I think that had a lot to do with it. And I just think that, I think Ben is done. I think that the offense became very simplistic and there was a lot of dinking and dunking throughout the whole season. And I think that teams finally caught up to that strategy, and the turnovers definitely increased in the later portion of the season, and passing yards definitely went down. You definitely had that one break in between that bad stretch where he threw 3 touchdowns against the Indianapolis Colts back in Week 16. And that was a huge win for the Steelers. And Ben definitely had some good games in 2020, but I think when you really look at it, he's a guy that you want to avoid because, first of all, you don't know what the status is with his elbow because he did get elbow surgery to repair that injury that he suffered in 2019. But, this guy is definitely not what he used to be, and he's definitely somebody that doesn't want to get hit. And the other thing is, the Steelers right now don't have a running back. They don't have a running back. James Conner left in free agency, so they're definitely going to try to address that spot. It looks like in the NFL draft, and you got guys like Najee Harris that could potentially fill that hole. The Alabama running back, just one of the guys that I can think of going into this draft. The Steelers don't have a running back, so that's number one. Number two, their offensive line is getting older. Mike Pouncey retired, their center, who's been there forever. He's retired. Alejandro Villanueva is a free agent. And listen, Ben is 39 years old. You got to protect him. And if they're not protecting him, he's not going to be able to do much. And when you really look at how he played in the game against the Browns in the playoffs, he was terrible. Really, the Steelers were terrible as a team, collectively. Really, from the first snap of the game, the snap going over Ben's head and the Browns scoring a touchdown off of that, Ben was a turnover machine in that game. And granted, yes, he threw for 500 yards, but when you think about it, a lot of that was in garbage time. And, you could argue and say, well, garbage time points matter in fantasy. But listen, I think Ben turned the ball over a lot in the later half of the season. He's not as accurate as he was 5 or 6 years ago. And I think when it comes to taking a QB in the later rounds, I think he's somebody that you kind of want to stay away from because he's a huge risk when it comes to turnovers. And really, when you just look at the Steelers, like I mentioned, no running back right now, and really a question mark at the offensive line position. Now, they do have most of their receivers returning. They re-signed Juju Smith-Schuster. They still have Chase Claypool, Deontay Johnson, and James Washington. But I just think that there are better QBs. Too many QBs. There's a lot of QBs that you could definitely draft over Big Ben. And I think because of that, you might want to avoid Big Ben Roethlisberger coming up when it comes to drafting your fantasy team in 2021. So with that, at number 4, we got Michael Gallup, the wide receiver for the Dallas Cowboys. Now, Michael Gallup is only 25 years old. He's going to be now approaching his 4th season in the NFL. The Cowboys took him in the 3rd round of the 2018 NFL Draft. I think the reason why I have him up here is because I did happen to take Michael Gallup in one of my leagues, and he definitely did not produce at the level that I would have liked him to have produced. Now, he was on my bench for the most part, and he didn't really play a key role on my team. But the reason why I have him on here is I think that watching a lot of the Cowboys games this past season in 2020, the thing that kind of stuck out to me was the fact that CeeDee Lamb got a lot more targets than Michael Gallup. And obviously Amari Cooper is the number 1 wide receiver in Dallas. And when you kind of look at Amari Cooper's stats, not Amari Cooper, when you look at Michael Gallup's stats, in 2019, Michael Gallup had over 1,000 yards. He had 6 touchdowns. In standard leagues, he had 146 points. He was productive. And not to say that he wasn't productive. In 2020, he played in 16 games. He had 5 touchdowns. But he only had 843 yards receiving. And and his point total in standard leagues definitely took a step back and decreased when he only had 114 fantasy points past season, which you can say a lot of that had to do with the fact that Dak Prescott suffered a season-ending injury against the New York Giants early on in the season, and the Cowboys were dealing with a lot of chaos at the quarterback position. First, they did start Andy Dalton, and then Andy Dalton suffered a concussion against the Washington football team, so Ben DiNucci had to start, so the Cowboys had to do a lot of trick plays against the Eagles, and then Andy Dalton eventually did come back and start for them. Actually, I forgot that Garrett Gilbert started at one point for the Dallas Cowboys against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Then Andy Dalton eventually came back. And Michael Gallup did have a couple of good games. He did have a good game against the Baltimore Ravens in Week 13, having 7 receptions, 11 targets, 86 receiving yards, 1 touchdown. The best game of the season definitely had to come against the Seattle Seahawks Week 3 when he had 138 receiving yards and 1 touchdown. Probably his second best game would have to be against the Eagles in Week 16 when he had 8 targets, 6 receptions for 121 yards, 2 touchdowns, and he had 24 points in that game for standard leagues. But like I said, I think that the reason why I have him on here is I think CeeDee Lamb definitely took targets away from him. The Cowboys are expecting Blake Jarwin to come back and be their starting tight end next season. And I think the Cowboys are going to run the ball a lot more now with Dak Prescott coming back from injury. I think that Ezekiel Elliott is going to have a big year, and that's why I had him as a top 10 player in the first segment of the show. I think that he's going to have a bounce-back season, and I think because of that, the Cowboys are going to run the football more. And I think that CeeDee Lamb kind of proved to be that number 2 wide receiver. And because of that, I think Michael Gallup is definitely going to continue to see a decrease in targets, and he's not going to put up that productivity that he did in 2019. So because of that, I have him on this list at number 4. So at number 3 on the list, I have wide receiver for the New England Patriots, Julian Edelman. Now, Julian Edelman, he's a 3-time Super Bowl champion. He's a Super Bowl MVP, which he received in 2018 when the Patriots defeated the Rams back then. But this past season in 2020, Edelman only played in 6 games, had 39 targets, 21 receptions, no touchdowns, only had 35 fantasy points in standard leagues, which is really the lowest point total that he's had since he really became one of Tom Brady's top targets back in 2013, because obviously Wes Welker, who was the longtime slot receiver for the New England Patriots, left for the Denver Broncos that season. So that was really when Julian Edelman kind of took on a more prominent role in the offense back in 2013. But definitely when you look at PPR leagues, he was definitely a guy that was very reliable in that category, getting a lot of targets was Tom Brady's top target, especially in 2019 when the Patriots didn't have a lot of receivers, a lot of dependable wide receivers, and, it was amazing that the Patriots, went 12-4 that season, which does go to show you what Tom Brady brings to the table and how he elevates guys on a team. Now, Edelman in 2019 was pretty good. Played in all 16 games, had over 1,000 yards, had 6 touchdowns, had 156 points, which was his career high in fantasy point totals. But the reason why I think that he's somebody you kind of have to forget about is, first of all, we really don't know the status of Julian Edelman. We don't know if he's, going to play this season. And a lot of that has to do with the fact injuries. This guy has dealt with a lot of injuries over his career. He's been beat up. And I think the injuries finally caught up to him, because all I remember back in the 2019 AFC Championship game against the Kansas City Chiefs, I just remember Edelman catching every pass on third down and just getting absolutely wrecked. Tough guy. He's a guy that plays through injuries. He plays hard, and he's somebody that you want to have on your team in real life. But in fantasy, I think that he's somebody you kind of want to stay away from, because you don't really know the status of Julian Edelman. And I think now Cam Newton coming back for another year under that system in New England, I think that he's kind of somebody you want to stay away for those reasons. And also, the other thing is, if Edelman is healthy, he's another guy that's going to have targets being taken away from him. The Patriots spent a boatload of money this offseason acquiring Kendrick Bourne and Nelson Aguilar to bolster that wide receiver position. And then you got to look at the fact that the Patriots back in the day loved to run 2 tight end sets, especially when they had Rob Gronkowski and Aaron Hernandez back in 2011 and 2012. And also when they did it back in 2015 and 2016 with Gronk and Scott Chandler and Gronk and Martellus Bennett. The Patriots love to run 2 tight end sets, and I think that's another thing as to why not to take Edelman, is because the tight ends are going to be heavily used on the New England Patriots, and they're going to be using that a lot, and that's going to take away targets for Julian Edelman, because the Patriots brought in Hunter Henry and Jonnu Smith, who were the top 2 tight ends in the offseason. And the fact that the Patriots were able to get those guys is incredible. The Patriots definitely reshaped their offense, and their offense is going to look a lot different than it did in 2020. But I just think there's way too many question marks surrounding Julian Edelman that he's definitely a guy you want to stay away from. He was once a very dependent wide receiver in fantasy, but I think now that Tom Brady is not there anymore to use him as a security blanket and the injuries finally caught up to him, I think he's a guy you definitely want to leave off your draft board. And maybe draft one of those guys that the Patriots brought in, but Julian Edelman is definitely somebody that you could leave off your draft board. And also because the Patriots are going to want to run the football as well. Cam Newton did not have a good season in terms of passing touchdowns, but he had about 12 rushing touchdowns. And the Patriots do love to run the football, and they got the guys that can do it in Sony Michel and Damian Harris, who is kind of an honorable mention in this list. Damian Harris, I liked how he played when he actually got carries and how he ran the ball, and I think that the Patriots are going to continue to use him. So the Patriots are going to continue to run the football. They're going to use the new weapons that they got. They're definitely going to use them a lot. And also with the injuries, I think is a collective... all of that together kind of leads me to believe the fact that Julian Edelman is not going to be the guy that he once was, a dependent wide receiver coming up in this NFL season. So I think he's somebody you want to stay away from, and I think that there's so many wide receivers, there's better options out there. So I think Julian Edelman you should leave off your team, and that's why he's coming at number 3 on the top 5 players that you want to avoid in your upcoming fantasy football drafts. So at number 2 on this list, I have running back Kenyon Drake, who recently just signed with the Las Vegas Raiders. Will be entering his 6th season in the NFL. He was taken in the 3rd round of the 2016 NFL draft by the Miami Dolphins. He had his career high in fantasy points with 167. Standard leagues, just missed 1,000 yards, having 955 rushing yards, which is definitely his career high. He had 10 rushing touchdowns in 15 games with the Cardinals. And the reason why I have him on this list is I just think that now being on the Raiders, Josh Jacobs is really going to have all the carries. And I think the only reason why Kenyon Drake would be a great fantasy option is if he was the number one back. But I just don't think that him signing with the Raiders, I think that Josh Jacobs is going to take a lot more carries away from him. Josh Jacobs is clearly the better running back. I could be wrong, but I just think he's somebody that you kind of want to leave out. And I think also the Raiders the Raiders' offensive line is kind of taking a step back. Let go of Gabe Hudson. They lost Gabe Jackson. They lost Rodney Hudson. So the offensive line is definitely going to be weaker than it was. And they also traded Trent Brown to the New England Patriots. And I think because of that, I think Kenyon Drake is somebody you want to leave out. And it's kind of surprising considering that, it seemed like he found a home in Arizona. It seemed like he was going to be the lead back, because they did push David Johnson out the door. And it seemed like Kenyon Drake was going to fit well with the Cardinals, but I guess they felt Chase Edmonds would be a better option at running back, and they didn't retain him. Kind of an interesting destination that Kenyon Drake picked to sign with in the offseason. But I just think that he's somebody that you want to stay away from. And if you do get him, definitely somebody you want to take in the later rounds. I think that Josh Jacobs is the better running back, and he's going to get more of the carries. And I think because of that, Kenyon Drake is going to be left out and not really going to be that effective going into next season. And finally, at number 1 of this list, I have tight end for the New York Giants, Evan Ingram. He's only 26 years old. He's entering his 5th season. He was taken in the first round of the 2017 NFL Draft, and he really hasn't panned out the way the New York Giants wanted him to. This guy is definitely a hybrid. He could be a receiver and a tight end, but he is a tight end, and he only had 78 fantasy points in standard leagues. He's a guy that I have taken in the draft. I took him in 2019 because I thought he was going to have a big year. He had a big week 1 game, I remember, in 2019 against the Dallas Cowboys. But he just really hasn't panned out. And the other thing is the guy can't stay on the field. The guy can't stay healthy. He's another one that just can't stay healthy. And, there's definitely some tight ends out there that are definitely better than him. I mean, they just signed Kyle Rudolph, and Kyle Rudolph is definitely going to get a lot of red zone targets. And I think that the Giants are definitely going to use 2 tight end sets. I like the Patriots. I think they're going to do the same thing. But I think Kyle Rudolph doesn't drop the ball too. That's the other thing. Evan Ingram drops the ball way too much. Okay? And I think because of the fact that Evan Ingram dropped that pass when they lost to the Eagles on Thursday night, I think that game right there was the reason why the Giants didn't win the division. But, you kind of look at Evan Ingram's stats. His best game of the season came in Week 12 against the Cincinnati Bengals when he had 6 receptions for 129 yards, and he had only 10 fantasy points. He only had double-digit fantasy points twice, against the Bengals and against Washington. And he only had 1 touchdown in 2020. That's another reason why, you want to have a tight end on your team that gets targets and, is a red zone weapon. And Evan Ingram, I don't think really provides that. And I think he's somebody that, we've given him so many chances. He's going to be going into his 5th year as a tight end in the NFL. And he really hasn't panned out. And the crazy thing is he made the Pro Bowl. He was a Pro Bowl tight end. I just think that I think for me as a fantasy player, I've given him enough chances. I think a lot of people have given him enough chances, and he really hasn't produced at the level that people would like him to. I think there's a lot better options out there. Now, obviously, there's not going to be a George Kittle and a Travis Kelce. There's no multiple George Kittle and Travis Kelces, okay? There's only one of those guys. There's only one George Kittle, there's only one Travis Kelce. There's other tight ends out there, lesser known tight ends that you could definitely get in the later rounds. Like I just mentioned with the Patriots, Jonnu Smith and Hunter Henry are definitely going to be involved in the Patriots offense. There's other tight ends out there that I think you could definitely get in later rounds. I just don't think Evan Ingram is worth drafting anymore. He could be a bench player. He could sit on your bench. But other than that, I just don't think that he's worth it in fantasy anymore, especially because he's not durable. He doesn't play. Except in 2020, he did play in all 16 games. But, in 2018, he played in 11. 2019, he played in 8. And he only had 654 receiving yards. But, we'll see what happens. I mean, these are all just predictions. But, yeah, that's my... that is my list for the top 5 players that you want to avoid in your upcoming fantasy drafts for the 2021 season. So to kind of recap, at number 5, we had QB Big Ben Roethlisberger from the Pittsburgh Steelers. At number 4, we had wide receiver from the Dallas Cowboys, Michael Gallup. At number 3, we had wide receiver from the New England Patriots, Julian Edelman. At number 2, we had running back of the Las Vegas Raiders, Kenyon Drake. And at number 1, we have the tight end for the New York Giants, Evan Ingram. So with that, we are going to take another break. When we come back, we're going to talk about my career as a fantasy football player, what I've done, what leagues I've won, what bad trades I've made, what heartbreaking losses I've suffered. It's kind of going to be a fun segment, I think, to get more personal with what I've done as a fantasy football player and the things that have happened to me over the 8 years that I've done fantasy football. So with that, we're going to take a quick break. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network.
Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
All right, and we are back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. In segment 3, we talked about the top 5 players that you want to avoid going into your fantasy football draft. And in this segment, which is unfortunately our last segment of the show, we're going to talk about my fantasy football career. What's happened to me during the years that I've done fantasy football, some of my biggest blunders, some of my heartbreaking losses, and obviously the good moments as well. There's a mix. There's a mix when it comes to my career as a fantasy football player. So let's kind of get into it. So I began playing fantasy football in 2013, and 2013 was the year that Peyton Manning had his historical season, breaking the touchdown pass record in a single season, throwing 55 touchdown passes. Now, that year, I believe I had the second overall pick. And in 2012, Adrian Peterson won MVP. So I took Adrian Peterson, unfortunately. And now Adrian Peterson did have a good season, but he didn't have the season that Peyton Manning had. And he didn't have the season that he had the year before that. And I also took, because we typically do 2 QB leagues, I took Eli Manning and I took RG3. Now, RG3, the season prior, had that terrible leg injury that really kind of affected his whole career. He was never the same after that. And because of that, now when you flash forward, 8 or 9 years later, the guy was now a backup QB for the Baltimore Orioles. The Baltimore Orioles. The guy was the QB for the Baltimore Ravens. And also that was the same year that Eli Manning led the league in interceptions for the 3rd time in his career, throwing, I believe, 27. I think he had 18 touchdowns to 27 interceptions. So, yeah, the first year didn't really go the way I wanted to. And I think the other thing is I was kind of new to it, so I really didn't understand how everything worked. I don't think I really checked fantasy that year. So, yeah, didn't really do anything 2013. 2014, I won my first fantasy league. I actually won 2 that year because I did an ESPN league and I also did a CBS league. My dad asked me to kind of be his general manager and basically help draft his team. And this was like a professional fantasy draft. We had the draft board. We got together with a bunch of people, family on my dad's side, and my dad's cousins' friends. They were all there, and it was a fun experience. It really was. But one of the things that I look back upon that I keep asking myself, why did I do that, was I took a defense. I took the Seattle Seahawks defense in the 3rd round. Now, the Seahawks won the Super Bowl the year before that, and everybody remembers them throttling the Denver Broncos 43-8. And that defense was historic in that game. Malcolm Smith had that pick 6. Cam Chancellor was flying all over the place. He had an interception in that game. The Broncos were absolutely overmatched in that game. And because of that, I'm like, the Seahawks are going to be the best defense in the NFL. I'm going to take them in the 3rd round. I remember taking Peyton Manning with the first pick. So I basically got a do-over from not taking him the year before that. And that was kind of Peyton's last really good season. But that CBS league, we ended up winning, and we ended up getting $1,000. We ended up winning $1,000 that year. And I had Rob Gronkowski, I had Antonio Brown, and also I was smart with my waiver wire picks because I picked up C.J. Anderson, who emerged as the Broncos' #1 running back, and I picked up Odell Beckham Jr. because that was Odell's rookie season, and he didn't play in the early portion of that season. So I had Odell Beckham Jr., Rob Gronkowski, Peyton Manning, and Antonio Brown all on the same team that year, and that team was insane. And then in the ESPN league, the 2QB league, 2014 was kind of a crazy year in the NFL. It was definitely one of my favorite seasons to look back on. That was the year that Bill Belichick said, "We're on to Cincinnati," and Aaron Rodgers said, RELAX, relax. And it just so happens that in that 2QB league, I had Aaron Rodgers and I had Tom Brady. So I had those guys going out there and winning me games every week. And that was one of my favorite QB combos. And when it comes to ESPN, I always have one of those 2 guys on my team when I win. Especially because this is kind of like the main league that I play with my friends from. I play with my friends from home. That's where I do my 2 QB league. But yeah, that was the first time I ever won amongst my group of friends. So that was my championship #1. Now, the following season, we made it back. My dad and I in the CBS league, we made it back to the championship. We lost, however, to my aunt. In the ESPN league, though, however, this was kind of 2015 was the year that I began to strongly dislike Kirk Cousins. Now, it really started last week of the season, week 17. So I was in the championship against my friend. I did not know if Kirk Cousins was playing or not because, typically, teams like to rest their starters and, rest them up for the playoffs. So I assumed that Kirk Cousins wasn't going to play, so I ended up picking up Brock Osweiler, who was starting for the Denver Broncos at the time. And basically what ended up happening was Kirk Cousins ended up playing Week 17. I think he threw 3 touchdowns against the Dallas Cowboys, who were awful that year because Tony Romo was injured, DeMarco Murray was gone. I think Des Bryant was in and out of the lineup. So Kellen Moore was starting for the Dallas Cowboys. So Kirk Cousins threw 3 touchdowns, had 20-plus points, I'm pretty sure, had a phenomenal game. So I started Brock Osweiler. Brock Osweiler ended up getting benched for Peyton Manning because Peyton Manning had the plantar fascia, and he was out for a couple games, and they wanted to go to Brock Osweiler because they believed Brock Osweiler gave him a better chance of winning because he was a younger, more athletic than Peyton, and he had the better arm than Peyton because Peyton's arm significantly declined over the past couple of seasons, and I think that had a lot, and of course that had a lot to do with the fact that, he had the neck injuries and whatever. So I had that happen, so basically Kirk Cousins, great game, Brock Osweiler, benched for Peyton Manning, then also D'Angelo Williams, who really was a great find in fantasy. I think a lot of people benefited from him because Le'Veon Bell tore his ACL that season. So D'Angelo Williams, who was actually filling in for Le'Veon Bell that season because Le'Veon had to start the year, I think it was like a 3 or 4 game suspension. So D'Angelo Williams filled in for him then, and then Le'Veon Bell got hurt, so D'Angelo Williams was the running back for the rest of the year. So then D'Angelo Williams got hurt. So I had that happen. I had Kirk Cousins having a great game, didn't think he was going to play. Brock Osweiler getting benched for Peyton Manning, and because of that, I lost the championship. So that was a very frustrating loss. In 2016, got back to what I usually do, and I won. I won our Friends League, and that was good. So I got championship number 2. In 2017, that had to be my worst year ever doing fantasy. I really had a bad strategy, and I didn't really learn. Now I think I'm a much better drafter than I was back then. In 2017, I took Aaron Rodgers pretty early. I took Antonio. I had the 2nd overall pick, and I took Antonio Brown with that pick. And actually, no, sorry, I didn't take Antonio Brown. That was the year after. I took Le'Veon Bell with my first pick. And, the season really didn't start the way I wanted it to. And I was kind of freaking out. So I ended up trading Le'Veon Bell to my friend for Devontae Adams and C.J. Anderson because my running backs were bad. Actually, no, sorry. My receivers weren't that good. And I was desperate. I needed to win. And what ended up happening was, of course, Aaron Rodgers broke his collarbone against the Minnesota Vikings that year. So I ended up having to start Brett Hundley. And, as we've done fantasy leagues, we've gotten people in the league now that actually are invested, that actually know football. This was 2017, so that's 3 or 4 years ago. We had people doing it that really weren't invested into football like I am and some of my other friends are. So what ended up happening was at one point I ended up losing to my friend. I don't remember the specifics, but he wasn't checking the league. And he ended up having 4 or 5 guys in his lineup that actually played, and I had my whole team going up against him, and I ended up losing. And he didn't even check. So that was embarrassing. And thank God we started doing punishments the year after, because if we did punishments that year, that would have been embarrassing. That would have been really embarrassing. 2018, my friends were teasing me. They were saying, we're going to take Aaron Rodgers. He's going to be gone by the time you pick. They were trying to get me to take Aaron Rodgers in the first round, and that didn't happen. That was when I ended up taking Antonio Brown with my first pick. I had the 2nd overall pick, and I took Antonio Brown. And I believe we were just doing standard leagues, so it would have been a lot better to take a running back. But then I ended up taking Aaron Rodgers as my 2nd pick. And again, I was overdrafting for a quarterback, and I should have took a running back, because running back is, in my opinion, the most important position when it comes to fantasy. So that team actually was 6-2 at one point. We ended up losing our final 4 games and ended up being 6-6. And I was fortunate enough to win one of the games in the losers bracket to not have to do the punishment, which was pretty simple at the time. It was just to dye your hair. But, I'm somebody that does not want to dye my hair. So that happened. 2019 was a really good year. I ended up winning the championship again. It was my 3rd ring in that league. I ended up winning against arguably the best team that was probably ever assembled in fantasy. It was the year that Kenny Golladay led the league in touchdown passes. My friend also had Jameis Winston, who was a fantasy monster that year. Aside from the turnovers, obviously, he had Chris Godwin, he had Mike Evans, he had Zach Ertz, who was having a crazy year, he had Miles Sanders, and he had Christian McCaffrey that year as well. He had a crazy team. And my team, I had Michael Thomas, who had a really good year. I took Todd Gurley, and Todd Gurley really didn't have the year that he had the season before because of the arthritis in his knee. I had Mark Ingram, who was a fantasy monster, but my 2 QBs were Patrick Mahomes and Tom Brady. Now, I thought my season was over when Patrick Mahomes got injured against the Broncos. I thought that was it. I thought I was missing the playoffs. I thought that was the end of it, but I ended up winning pretty much all of my remaining regular season games. I made it to the playoffs, and I beat this team in the championship because in Week 16, it really came down to the Eagles versus Cowboys game. And Miles Sanders broke through the hole and to get the first down, to basically end the game. And I thought he was going to continue running, and that would have been the end of it. I would have lost, and he ended up taking a knee, and that was it. I had Patrick Mahomes playing that night. He got me over the hump. I ended up defeating my friend in the finals that year, in 2019, and I ended up capturing my 3rd championship. So now we get to 2020. 2020 has been a crazy year for many different reasons outside of fantasy football. But I probably had the 3 most heartbreaking losses that I have ever had in a fantasy player. So the first one came at the expense of Kenyon Drake. So now in the previous segment, I talked about how Kenyon Drake is somebody you want to avoid taking in your drafts, and you're probably thinking, well, is now the reason why you did that was because of what you're about to say, which is I'm not a particular fan of Kenyon Drake after what he made me go through. So I was playing my friend. I think it was whenever the Cowboys were playing the Cardinals. It was Week 6, I think it was, and he had Kenyon Drake. My friend Chris had Kenyon Drake. I had Amari Cooper, and we were basically going back and forth the whole game. But Amari Cooper wasn't getting the points that I needed him to get to help me beat my friend. And it was crazy. At the very end, the Cowboys' last drive that actually kind of meant something, they got a touchdown. So I ended up going up, I think it was by 6 or 7 points against my friend. And I was so happy. I was going crazy. Well, not really going crazy because, this is while I'm in my dorm room. My roommate was sleeping at the time, so I didn't want to go crazy. I didn't want to wake him up. So I ended up going into my other roommate's room, and I'm like, I'm winning now. So now all I got to do is have the Cardinals just, take a knee on the ball, and let's get out of here. Give me that win. And my roommate, Johnny, said, well, really the only thing that can happen is if Kenyon Drake breaks one and scores a touchdown. That's the only way you lose. So I'm like, yeah, the odds of that happening are very slim. So I come back in the room, I'm watching the game, and the Cardinals are on 3rd down, and Kenyon Drake breaks through the hole. There's no safety back there, and he breaks away for the touchdown. And as that's happening, I'm going, is this really happening right now? So then I go back into my other roommate's room, And they're like, what happened? Now, I have cable, so I'm ahead of them. They're watching it on a stream. So they're like, no, and they were, same thing as me. They were like, they couldn't believe that it happened. So I ended up losing that game because Kenyon Drake decided to continue to embarrass the Dallas Cowboys and, add on to the onslaught that was a 38-10 victory. And I ended up losing that game. So then, and by the way, my friend Chris did not see, he wasn't even watching the game, so he didn't even know that happened. But that was a very heartbreaking loss, to say the least. See, now, Kenyon Drake could have took a knee. Now, I won the championship in 2019 because Miles Sanders took a knee and didn't go and score a touchdown. And then Kenyon Drake goes ahead and scores a touchdown without doing that. Now, a couple weeks later, I was playing my friend, and Nick Chubb came back from injury. This was when the Browns were playing the Houston Texans, and this was towards the end of the game. They were up 10-7, and Nick Chubb braced to the outside. He's running down the sideline, and I was over at my cousin's house. I turned around in celebration. I was so happy that Nick Chubb did that. He was going to score a touchdown, give me more points, and also, help me cover that 3.5-point spread because I do a football pool as well, and I took the Browns in that game, and I switched it. I originally had the Texans, and my cousin goes, he stepped out. I'm like, what? And I turn around, and Nick Chubb ran out of bounds at the 1-yard line, and the Browns ended up winning by 3 points. I didn't get any fantasy points I didn't get a touchdown from that, and I ended up losing my fantasy matchup pretty handily, as my friend's team did end up going off in the second half game, because those games took place in the 1 o'clock window. So now we get to probably the most heartbreaking loss. Well, yeah, probably the most heartbreaking loss of the season. So I was playing my other friend in this same league. I was up by 37 points going into the Sunday night football game between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Las Vegas Raiders. We do have PPR this league now. So my friend had Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce. So I was basically winning that game the entire time until the last drive of the game when Patrick Mahomes threw a touchdown pass to Travis Kelce. And with 40 seconds left, and I ended up losing that game as well. That was probably one of the most heartbreaking losses. And it was frustrating because my friend kept saying he was going to lose the game the whole time. And I'm saying, don't say that. It's not over yet. And yeah, that was really hard. And I thought my playoff season, I thought the playoffs were done. I thought I had no shot of making it. I did, however, end up making the playoffs, which was nice. But he ended up beating me in the playoffs as well. And I ended up going 0-3 against him on the season. And actually, in 2018, he was the reason why I missed the playoffs there too. So he made me miss the playoffs in 2018 by 1 game, and he's the reason why I was eliminated from the playoffs in 2020. Now, this other heartbreaking loss, and this is the last thing I'll talk about before we close out the show for today, happened in another league. I did another league with my college friends. So I was losing by, I want to say, 20-something points. I needed Will Lutz and Emmanuel Sanders to come through for me. It came down to the Sunday night football game between the Tampa Bay Bucks and the New Orleans Saints. The Saints obviously throttled the Bucks, winning 38-3. And I ended up winning against my friend. Or so I thought. So what ended up happening was stat corrections came into play, and he had the Washington football defense, and they forgot to add a sack. So because of that, they added the sack, and I ended up losing by 0.3 of a point to my friend. And that was it. I missed the playoffs in that league. That was just annoying because you should have had those stats corrected prior to that game being played. Because you make me think, oh, my playoff hopes are alive. I have a chance. And then, of course, the next morning I find out I lost the game because of it. So, yeah, so there was a lot of heartbreaking losses this past fantasy season. And I'm looking forward to, seeing what, I do in the fantasy leagues that I'm in this upcoming season. I definitely think I'm a lot better of a drafter than I was when I first started. I definitely know that running backs and wide receivers are the key components to a fantasy team, and that QBs are there's a lot of QBs, and you really can't, for the most part, you can't go wrong with QBs. But running backs and wide receivers are the key. And like I said, I'm a much better drafter, and I know that now. I know a lot more than I did, when I first started out back in 2013. So that's basically kind of the overview of how my fantasy career has been the last 8 or 9 years, and I look forward to continue to win in these leagues that I do, and add another championship to my fantasy football resume. So with that is all the time that we have for today. I thank you for listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us out. And to also follow us on the main social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So with that is all the time that we have. Thank you for listening. I'm Kenneth Gruenfelder, signing off from the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast Network, saying have a good day, and we will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.